In it dwelt Taylor and his family. As the name implies, he was a tailor by profession. Taylor and his family were different in one respect. They did not belong to the majority Chi tribe. They were instead Ewes, who had moved from their home in the eastern part of the country to dwell in our midst. Like the majority of the inhabitants, however, they were also peasant farmers. For the reader not conversant with the makeups of the population of Ghana, it is important to know that the population of Ghana is not homogeneous, but made up of several tribes that speak entirely different languages from one another. One might think of the relationship between the Japanese, English, Portuguese languages. Hardly any conflict arose on the grounds of one's tribe, however. Indeed, Taylor became one of the most popular citizens in the community. The last building structure on that side of the road housed the communal male latrine, which was situated about 10 meters away from the roadside. That was as far as the village stretched. I will estimate the distance from our home to the other end of the village as approximately 150 meters. Next, I will take the reader to the other side of the road and continue from where back to the other end of the road. At the time I was big enough to go to school, there was no school at Impintimpi. In the course of time, the population of the settlement grew to the point where the authorities recognized the need to start a primary school there. The school was built at the outskirts of the village, on the other side of the road where we were the moment. About 20 meters away from the school was the home of Papa Kwesi Kuma. He lived in his big compound with his 2 wives. He belonged also to the Ewe tribe, having moved to the little village to cultivate the land several years before my eyes saw the light of day. Papa Kwesi Kuma happened to be good friend of father. Occasionally, we went to their home to play, though they were at home in the Twi language, probably in an effort to get us to learn their language. They occasionally gave us instructions in their language. Even today, I still remember the Ewe invitation to join in a meal, Vamidunu. At the time I was growing up, there was a large open space between Papa Kwesi Kuma's compound and the next building on that side of the road. When I was about 10 years old, rumors began to spread to the effort that CMB was planning to put up a building in our little village. What does CMB stand for? You may well ask. It stands for Cocoa Marketing Board. Later on in my narration, I will return to have a closer look at cocoa, the main cash crop of Ghana, then as now the CMB. a governmental agency, purchased cocoa beans from the farmers for export and further processing within the country. The bulk was exported. Though several other firms have, in the meantime, sprung up to compete with it. At the time I was growing up, the CMB had the lion's share of the market in the country. As far as Impintimpi was concerned, it was the sole purchaser. The cocoa farmer at Impintimpi was in a sense blessed in having a local purchasing agent for cocoa. In several other cocoa producing areas of the community, residents had to walk distances carrying sacks of cocoa beans on their heads or necks to the next available purchasing agent. Prior to putting up their own building, the local CMB operated from the extended family home of Papa Yao Mensah. They had rented a hall and an office for this purpose. Not long after the news began to circulate in the village, we woke up one morning to the deafening sound of heavy earth-moving machinery approaching the village from the direction of Nkoko. At home, we thought they were probably heading for Afosu, the comparatively bigger settlement about 5 kilometers to the south. But no, on reaching the center of our village, they made a stop. The mere fact that the huge machines had parked in the village center was a source of great excitement, not only for me, but also for my peers. Not only in our fetus, children, slaves, we soon poured into the streets, hopping, jumping, cheering, and waving in excitement. We drew as near as the drivers would permit us to have a closer look at the huge metal monsters. I was particularly fascinated by the rolling metal wheels of caterpillar excavators, as well as the huge tires of the motor graders. Soon the drivers of the construction machines went into action to prepare the piece of land I have already referred to for the construction of the new building to house the CMB. Over the next several months, economic activity boomed in our little village, needed local labor. Eventually, several able-bodied men and women, not only from Impintimpi but also from the surrounding villages, were employed as casual laborers, collecting gravel and sand, mixing concrete, producing concrete blocks as masons and mason assistants, etc. Several women in the village, including mother, set up chop bars where the construction workers went to fill their stomachs. After about 6 months of brisk activity, the large cocoa shed, as it came to be known, was complete. It was comprised of a huge storage hall measuring about 75 meters by 30 meters, where the cocoa beans were kept prior to their transport to the harbor, and also served as an office for the clerk. Connected to the main building at one end was smaller building that served as a residence for the clerk. To this day, the cocoa shed remains one of the most prominent buildings in the village. 3 important persons resided in the compound next to the CMB, a compound in which resided other extended family members of Nana Kofi Poku, the village chief. The first of the 3 was Nana Abena, the queen of the little village, the elder sister of the chief. At the time I was big enough to understand my environment, she was almost blind and had to be led around the village by one of her grandchildren. Nana Abena was decent and well-respected member of the community. Then there was Papa Teacher, who was junior both to the chief and the queen. As the name implies, he was a teacher by profession, having taught in several places during his long career. He had, in the meantime, retired and returned to his village to cultivate the land. At that time, he pastored the Presbyterian Church, one of the 2 churches in the village. The church leading personality in the building that was home to several other members of their extended family was Papa Osei. He could, without exaggeration, be referred to as the village doctor, Papa Osei. What is a person he was? He never received any formal education. He had neither an idea of human anatomy nor of pathology. Terms like physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology sounded like Latin in his ears. Yet, he dutifully and meticulously went about practicing his art of healing, from the common cold to severe malaria, from the ordinary headache to migraine, from menstrual pain to the inability of women to bear children. Whatever the ailment, he was the first person residents of the village contacted to help cure their condition. In time, his name spread far beyond the boundaries of our small village, as the sick traveled many kilometers to consult him. He now arrived at one of the most prominent buildings in the settlement. 2 important individuals lived there, Papa Yao Mensah as well as Papa Kwabena. They were brothers, the former being the elder of the 2, as I just indicated. It used to house the local CMB. As I stated earlier, Papa Yao Mensah was father's stepfather. He resided in his extended family with several other members of his traditional African family. After he had had several children with my paternal grandmother, he married a second wife, Mami Tomo One of the children of Mami Tomo was Moses, who became one of my closest associates. He was a brilliant student and could also have traveled far on academic ladder. Had also got a chance to move into a secondary school. He could have made it, but he could not find anyone to pay for his boarding fees. In the end, he ended up with a middle school leaving certificate, which could not take him very far. Papa Kwabena, to whom I referred earlier, was married to Mami Jemfua, our direct neighbor on the same side of the road. For his orderliness, hard work, discipline, and sense of duty, he earned the nickname German Bruni, which translated means literally the white man from Germany. He was indeed a hard-working individual who had little patience for those who in his eyes were lazy and unwilling to shed enough sweat to accomplish something in life. He could also be described as the no-nonsense type of person. For the most part, was not only serious about himself, but also about the rest of the world around him. It was his custom to leave home early in the morning to work on his farm. In the afternoon, one might see him returning from the fields with a heavy load made up of all possible items on his head, as well as on both shoulders. One might be forgiven then for thinking the daily course of German Bruni had ended. But no, after he had rested for a while, he got up, took his machete, and headed for the woods yet again. One could only wonder what was driving him to the woods at the time of day. Was he on his way to inspect the traps he had set for rodents, such as grass cutter? Was he on his way to the Nui River to inspect his fish traps? Was he on his way to get some assignment done on another field? 2 or 3 hours later, one will find him returning to the village, once again bearing a whole load on his head. Even then, it will be premature to conclude that the daily chores of German Bruni beyond the borders of his home were over for the day. Again, no. Minutes later, he will be seen heading for woods for the 3rd time. God only knew what for. The building in which Papa Kwabena resided, together with that of the palace that stood almost directly opposite it on the other side of the road, was popular meeting place for the children and youth of the village at night, especially on the moonlight night. This was by virtue of the fact that both were located at the very heart of the little settlement. Sometimes the meeting turned noisy. The majority of the residents in the building were not bothered. If they were, at least they did not express it. Not so Papa Kwabena. He was prompt to react at the least opportunity by warning us either to behave ourselves or else quit the premises. Children, often we failed to realize how serious German Bruni was with his threats and continued. Even during the latter part of his life, as his eyesight began to fail him, German Bruni kept a firm hold of his principles, although he could no longer visit his farms as often as he would want to. The necessary strength enabled him to come out to drive away offending children from his premises, never forsook him. Concealed from the main road by the building just described was the home of Mame Kakraba, father's second wife. As the story goes, after father and mother had been married for about 10 years, the parents of the young woman, impressed by his hard work and sense of duty, offered him their daughter in marriage. Father accepted the offer. Mother, as might be expected, was not happy with the new development. As she later told us, she decided to live with changed situation because she feared her children might be disadvantaged by the woman. It was not father who built the home for his second wife. It was put up by Papa Kofi Du, her uncle. He lived at Afosu, a town about 5 kilometers to the south of Impintimpi, but had a few cocoa farms at Impintimpi. He entrusted the building to the care of his niece, keeping only a small room that he occupied during his occasional visit to the village. About 100 meters away from stepmother's home, somehow isolated from the rest of the village, was the Presbyterian church. It was built with mud and measured about 10 meters in length and 5 meters in width. Its walls rose to about 3 meters above the ground. It boasted a roof made of corrugated aluminum sheets. Inside the building were 2 rows of 7 wooden benches. Each bench was capable of seating 5 worshippers. Returning to the main road and continuing down the road, we come to the home of Mame Adjoa Nimo. She was a widow. Her husband having passed away several years before I was born. One of her children, Atakufi, was a good friend of ours, my brothers and I. On several occasions, he joined us on one of our regular expeditions to hunt for German, pound rat, and grass cutter. More on that topic later. The next building along the road was erected by Papa Osei, the village doctor, for his wife. As I learned from mother, Papa Osei used to be addicted to alcohol. For a while, he appeared more interested in satisfying his cravings for alcohol than the need to settle down to marry and raise a family. One day, he returned from one of his journeys through the surrounding villages to inform his family members that he had overcome his addiction. "That is a joke," one of them remarked. "No, it isn't," Papa Osei said and added, "The Lord Jesus Christ has set me free. You must indeed be losing your mind from too much drinking." Another retorted, "No, I am not," he insisted. "Someone met on one of my journeys, took me to his church. After the service, I accepted Christ into my life. Now I am free." Initially, hardly any of them thought he could give up his drinking habits. He had on several previous occasions failed in his attempt to do so. And so, they had all given up hope that he could ever succeed in turning away from drink. This time, however, he did indeed overcome his addiction forever. In the end, he opened a branch of the Apostolic Church, the church in which he gave his life to Jesus. The church held its worship services in a large room in the home he had built for his young and attractive wife, who was also a member of the Apostolic Church. The next building belonged to the extended family of Mami Adjoa Adiye and her brother, Papa Ankoma. They were our direct neighbors just across the main road. Partly as a result of that, a close bond of friendship developed between the inhabitants of both compounds. Later in this narration, I will talk about the special relationship that developed between two individuals, each from one of the two homes. At the time I was growing up, the compound of Mami Adjoa Adiye happened also to be the first one on that side of the road approaching the village from Nkoko. In the course of time, Kofi Dagati, who arrived from the north of the country to look for a work as a casual laborer on the fields of cocoa farmers erected a small building to house himself and his wife Adjoa Dagati. Later, Papa Kwesi Buruku, who became a good friend of father's, also arrived to cultivate a piece of land he had acquired from one of the inhabitants. He built his house behind that of Mame Ajua Adeye, away from the main road, several meters behind the property of Papa Bruku was the football field constructed through the sweat of the local football team. I will return to the football pitch later in my narration. That ends the tour around my little village. Thank you, dear reader, for bearing with me. Someone may want to know the population of the village at that point in time. The answer is that there was no official figure for that. My guess is that it was around 100. The next chapter. As was the case with almost every child who was born in Impintimpi, my birth took place at home. According to mother, a small rectangular wooden structure that served as the family bathroom was my labor ward. It measured about 1 meter in length and 80 centimeters in width. The wooden was rose to about 1.5 meters above ground level. At the top, the structure was open to the free tropical skies. The floor was not cemented but covered with fine gravel. As in the case of many of the births that took place in the village, Papa Osei, the village doctor, was the main person in charge of affairs. He was helped by a few elderly women of the settlement. By the time I was big enough to understand my environment, we were 7 children at home, 5 boys and 2 girls. I had 4 elder brothers and 2 younger sisters. In the course of time, I noticed that mother's stomach was growing bigger and bigger with the days. Soon the news made the rounds that a new arrival was expected in our home. Then one day, mother disappeared into the family bathroom. Prior to doing so, she sent one of us on an errand to fetch Mame Jemfua and Mame Ajua Adeye. Not long thereafter, the 2 women rushed into our compound. "Where is your mother?" they asked as if with one voice. We pointed to the bathroom. Soon both women rushed in there. For next several hours, they remained with mother in the small enclosure. After a while, one of them emerged. We could read the English in her eyes. Turning to one of my senior brothers, she began, "Hurry up and fetch Papa Osei. Tell him we need his help urgently." Not long thereafter, Papa Osei came rushing to our home and joined the women. I was too young to understand what exactly was going on. The expression on the faces of the adults led me, however, to believe that was all not well. Finally, about an hour after the arrival of the village doctor, we could hear the screams of a baby. It was followed almost immediately by the claps and shouts of joy of the three adults attending to Mother. Several minutes later, Mother, who seemed to be in terrible pain, emerged, assisted by the two women. Tenderly, they led her into her bedroom. She remained there for the rest of the day. Poor, deprived, destitute, want. You can go on listing all the epithets of words we associate with a state of improvement were my best company. Though several years have passed since then, I still remember that when I was very young, I possessed a disproportional big head and stomach. As a result of that, whenever I walked around the little settlement clothed only with Peter, I was taunted not only by my peers, but also by some of the adults with cause pin Tom, referring to my protruding belly and coconut head. I was highly tempered as a child. I can tell you, needless to say, I was easily infuriated by their taunts. In my anger, I got hold of a small stone and threatened to throw it at one of the offender. I just could not understand why anyone would be so mean to me. In regard to my stomach, it might well be due to kwashiorkor, as I have since learned. Kwashiorkor, a local Ghanaian term that has gained international usage, is a condition found in children with a chronic deficiency of protein in their diet. Kwashiorkor might not have been the sole cause of my problem. However, parasitic worms were widespread condition not only at Mpintimpi but in several parts of the country. That should come as no surprise considering the prevalent hygienic conditions. Even as I write, I remember an occasion when my parents, suspecting the worms might be the cause of my distended stomach, gave me insonsumduro, literally worm medicine they had bought from the weekly market at Nyamfuman to drink. Even today, I remember the pleasant taste of the green-looking liquid they call worm medicine. To verify their suspicion, Mother did not leave me to empty my bowels in the public latrine. Instead, she gave me a chamber pot for that purpose. This is no exaggeration, but the bare truth. Dear reader, the worms that came out of my bowels, they were not tiny bits, but rather long, round worms, about 30 centimeters long and about 5 millimeters in diameter. There were loads of them, coiled together in a large bundle. They looked like the large earthworms I saw on my way to farms or the riverside. Indeed, they looked very alike. Today, I know they carry the medical term Ascaris rubricados or roundworms, which, of course, are quite different from earthworms. That they made their home in my bowels and competed with me for the very food my parents managed to put on the table was a display of unbelievable impudence on their part. The next chapter, recruiting for the academic journey. On 6 March 1957, Ghana, then Gold Coast, gained independence from the British. The first post-independent administration, headed by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the man who led the country into independence, soon introduced free and compulsory education for all. The policy of compulsory education was enforced to the very letter. Aware that some among the farming population who hitherto had relied on the helping hands of their children would be reluctant to send them to school, the government sent school inspectors around to enforce the rule. Woe unto the parents who tried to prevent their children from attending school. It was during that time I was sent to school. How could authorities determine that a child, the overwhelming of majority of whom did not possess birth certificates, indeed, any one of us had that important document at all, had reached school-going age? Several years have elapsed since then, but I still remember how the recruitment exercise was carried out in our little village. With our piece of cotton cloth in tama wrapped around our bodies, we assembled on the veranda in front of the palace, one after the other. Each of us was asked to use one arm to make a ball over the head and attempt to touch the ear on the other side of his or her body. Whoever was able to do so was deemed mature enough to begin the academic journey. It was customary for children about to start school to adopt a Christian name. Neither myself nor my older brother, Kwame, who was also about to start school, boasted Christian names. Father and mother, both illiterate, had no idea of such names. The task eventually fell on Ransford, who had gone quite far in his education to help his two junior brothers out on the matter. His method was not without ingenuity. First, he wrote down several European first names familiar to him. Next, he instructed us to listen attentively as he read them out. The rule was for us to shout, "Stop!" Should he call out a name that appealed to us? We don't quite remember any longer as to which of the two of us first asked Ransford to stop at a name. In any case, Kwame was so excited by the sound of the name Edmund that he responded at once. For my part, I plowed for Robert. We had to wear a uniform. For the boys, it was khaki skirt and the khaki trousers. This applied to every boy attending the state schools. As far as the girls were concerned, the color of their uniform could be green, blue, pink, or white, depending on the choice of the school concerned. As we left home for school, for the very first time, hardly any of the students heading from Impintimpi to attend the school at Nyafuman wore the prescribed uniform. Instead, we were clothed in our traditional intama that we usually wrapped loosely around our body to prevent the article of clothing from slipping away from our body as we went through the various activities of the school day. We wrapped them in such a way as to permit us to tie two ends loosely around our necks. For a while, our teachers tolerated those who attended school without a uniform. A time came, though, when such pupils were sent home and not permitted to return until they had acquired their respective uniforms. The person sent home could return after a while with a brand new uniform. After wearing the same uniform, hardly any parent could afford 2 sets at a time for a year or two. It invariably began to show signs of wear and tear. Eventually, the small tears developed into rare potholes. The time came when the uniform began to reveal almost entirely the clothes being worn beneath. At the beginning, our teachers would ask us to remind our parents politely about the need to replace them. Let's wait for the cocoa harvesting season. They will reply. Sometimes the season passed without any sign of the poor uniform being relieved of its duty. Finally, a time came when the class teachers could bear the situation no longer and sent the pupil home to acquire a new uniform. At the time I began my academic journey, the school system in Ghana was made up in the main of 3 cycles. The first cycle, or elementary school, took a minimum of 6 years and a maximum of 10 years to complete. From there, one could move on to the second cycle, or secondary school. Elementary schools were spread throughout the country. The situation was different in regard to secondary schools. They were found mainly in large towns and cities and were run mostly as boarding schools. Tuition was free in all schools. Students who attended the boarding schools were, however, expected to pay for their boarding and lodging. 5 years of secondary school education ended with the GCE O-level examinations. Those who performed well could proceed to do a 2-year sit form and sit for GCE A-level, advanced level examinations. 3 passes at the A-level was normally required to open the way for admission into the university. For most of the children, waking up early at Impintimpi to prepare for school, the best hope for the school system offered was the completion of the 10-year elementary education and the sitting of the final standard 7 examination, also generally known as Hall. One could then proceed to learn a trade or else find a job as an office clerk, a store assistant, a primary school teacher, etc. The next chapter, the tedious walk to and from school. We got up early on a typical school day. The first task for the day was a walk to the New River, about a mile away, to fetch water for the home. The water was collected in plastic or aluminum buckets of various sizes, each capable of holding between 5 to 10 liters of water. We carried the load on our heads. On a typical day, we undertook 2 to 3 trips. In the rainy season, when there was usually sufficient supply of water at home, we were spared that daily early morning real time. When time permitted, we did have a proper bath. If, on the other hand, we were hard pressed for time, we washed only our hairs, our armpits, and both legs from the knees downwards. Next, we hastily ate our breakfast, made up mainly of boiled plantains and stew. It was customary for all children from Impintimpi heading for school at Nyafuman to do so in single group. The practice was for those who got ready first to go round the homes of the children to urge them to hurry up. There were times, though, when the group could not wait forever for one to be ready before heading for school. Children as young as 6 years old, walking a distance of 2 miles to school, the mind boggles. And yet, that was precisely the case. The bigger ones, those in the upper classes, kept an eye on the little ones as we journeyed on. We walked along the main road leading to Nkoko, though traffic on it was sparse. We could still reckon with a few vehicles passing by in either direction as we journeyed on. The road was not tarred. Besides that, it had potholes in several places. As a result, the vehicles could not travel with considerable speed. This allowed us sufficient time to park ourselves along the fringes of the road long before the vehicles reached us. In the dry season, the passing vehicles left considerably dust in their trails. That was a source of considerable irritation, not only because we were forced to inhale the dust, but also because it resulted in our uniforms getting dirty. If the dust was a source of irritation, then the other factor in the equation, namely the rain, was less comforting. In the geographical region where we lived, it either rained or shined. If it poured down heavily in the morning long before we set out for school, we stayed away from school for that entire day. Usually, however, the rains did not come down early in the morning. Instead, it caught us by surprise, just as we were heading for school or returning home from school. In such a situation, we were left with no other choice than to take an involuntary shower, for hardly any of us carried an umbrella. If by chance one of us was carrying a cutlass to be used to wade on his or her plot, more on the issue of plots later, we cut the broad leaves of a banana or plantain trees growing in the farms bordering the road and used them as improvised umbrellas. Sometimes the problems brought by the rain were compounded by the passing vehicles. As I just pointed out, the road was not devoid of potholes. When it rains, ponds of water gathered in several places on the road. So when the passing vehicles drove through them, they sent splashes of dirty water in all directions to soil our cloth. Some of the drivers left the impression on our minds that they just wanted to show the young academics on the road who really was in charge of the roads. For they drove through potholes ponds, that in our opinion could have been avoided, even if the vehicles passing by on a rainy day did not cause us problems. The mud caused by the rain did so by swelling our feet. Fortunately, there was a small stream a few hundred meters away from school. So we headed there and cleaned our feet before reaching the school compound. The fact that all of us, without any exception, walked barefooted to school brought with it its own peculiar problems. In the dry season, the scorching tropical sun heated the ground we were walking on. As we walked along, we could feel the burning sensation under our soles. On some occasions, the driver of a vehicle pulled over and gave us a lift. Those were very rare instances. Though, in the first place, most of the vehicles that passed by were already filled to the last seat. Even if a vehicle boasted a few unoccupied seats, the fact that we usually walked in a group of not less than 6 students at a time might have prevented the driver from pulling to a stop and taking only a fraction along. It is not hard to imagine the consternation of the faces of those who were left behind. The next chapter. God bless our homeland, Ghana. We barely had to hurry up to avoid being late for school. For failure to arrive on time could have serious consequences. Later on, I will look more closely at the forms of punishment meted out to us. One had to be at school several minutes before the beginning of lessons. Why the need to do so? The task of tidying up the school, the classrooms, the immediate as well as surrounding compound fell to the lot of the school children. The whole school population was divided into 4 sections, named respectively after the colors blue, green, red, and yellow. Each section had a leader selected from a pupil in the most senior class. In the case of the primary school, this was primary class 6. The section leader in his turn was accountable to the teacher assigned to the section. The immediate compound surrounding the school was divided among the 4 sections. The section in turn allotted a piece of plot to each pupil. It was the duty of each pupil to keep his or her portion of plot tidy, including weeding it and also collecting any trash that might have been discarded on it. It was expected of every student to visit his or her plot every day to make sure it was tidy. On regular intervals, the section teacher, or sometimes the head teacher himself, went round to inspect the plot. Such inspections were mostly unannounced. Each student had to stand on his or her plot during the inspection, or until him or her whose plot was untidy, he or she risked being caned. The actual school day began at 8:30 a.m. with an assembly that was held in the open in front of the school building. Each class lined up in two parallel lines facing the school building. Short girls in the very front, followed by the tall ones, then the short boys like myself, and finally the tall ones as the rear. Even the manner in which we formed the lines could bring a student into trouble. The lines were expected to be straight, and anyone caught disrupting it could be called forward and caned before the whole school. To achieve a decent straight line, each of us stretched the right arm and touched the shoulder of the child in front of him or her. After school prefect or the student on duty that day had convinced him or her that the decent straight line had been formed, the order came for us to put our hands down. The assembly was open with a Christian-based meditation. Though it was state school, that fact did not cause offense to anyone. The population of the area was mostly Christian, the remaining being adherents of various traditional African forms of worship. At that period, about 20% of the population of Ghana were Muslims, most of whom lived in northern Ghana, which was several miles away from the borders of our little village. The meditation was followed by the recitation of the national pledge. I promised on my honor to be faithful and loyal to Ghana, my motherland. I pledge myself to the service of Ghana with all my strength and with all my heart. I promise to hold in high esteem our heritage won for us through the blood and toil of our fathers, and I pledge myself in all things to uphold and defend the good name of Ghana. So help me God. Every student had to stand in a salute position during the recitation. Next, we sang the first stanza of the national anthem. God bless our homeland Ghana and make our nation great and strong, bold to defend forever the cause of freedom and of right. Fill our hearts with truth and humility, and make us cherish fearless honesty, and help us to resist oppressors' rule with all our will and might forevermore. Each one of us was required to stand in the attention position during the singing of the anthem. In our part of the world, it was not usually on such an occasion for one to be disturbed by a fly or a bee or both. Still, we were required to be motionless throughout the duration of the singing of the anthem. Those who were caught moving could be punished with few lashes immediately after the song was over. After we had pledged ourselves to our nation and sang the national anthem, the teacher on duty, or the head teacher, as the case may be, read out the announcements. Finally, we marched into our classroom, singing most scores of 10 out to be our favorite marching song. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching us to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ the royal master lays against the foe. Forward into battle, see his banner go. The school day was divided into two main sessions, namely the morning and the afternoon. For the primary school, which could be described as years 1 to 6 of the elementary school, the morning session began at 8:30 a.m. and ended at 11:30 a.m. This was followed by a lunch break, which lasted till 1:30 p.m. The afternoon session ended at 3:30 p.m. In the case of the middle school, 7 year to year 10, the morning session was from 8:30 a.m. to 12 o'clock noon, followed by the lunch break, which lasted till 1:30 p.m. in their case. The evening session ended at 4 o'clock p.m. In the primary school, one particular exercise became almost part and parcel of the morning school life. This was commonly known as mental. During mental, we were given problems in arithmetic, usually 10, sometimes 20 calculations to solve mentally. The teacher usually found the time to mark it soon after it was over. 1 or 2 errors by a student were usually permitted. More errors could result in the students being caned. During the lunch break, our classmates who hailed from Nyafuman returned home to enjoy hot meal prepared by their parents or relatives, or in some cases by themselves. Students from Impintimpi and elsewhere who did not call Nyafuman bring cooked meals along in the morning to be eaten during the break, or to carry raw foodstuffs along that they could cook during the break time. The second option was favored by those who happened to have relations or friends who were prepared to allow them into their homes to prepare their meals. Understandably, most of us preferred the second option because of the hot meal is guaranteed. In our case, mother had a friend who allowed us to cook our meals or lunch in her home. Other classmates from Impintimpi and elsewhere who did not enjoy that privilege had to content themselves with eating meals they had carried along with the morning. Needless to say, their food had turned cold by the time it was eaten. If mental arithmetic was a regular exercise for our young brains in the morning dictation served to achieve a similar purpose during the afternoon section. The teacher read out 10 to 20 words that had to be spelled correctly. As in the case of mental, those who scored below the accepted mark set by the teacher could be caned. Next chapter. The young academic on points of exploration. Walking home from school in the evening was a more tedious undertaking compared to the morning walk to school. Not only was one exhausted from the day's activities, but usually also hungry and thirsty. Those who might have thought we would enjoy immediate respite on returning home from a tedious day's activity at school will have jumped to a premature conclusion. Indeed, most of our parents took the assistance we would offer them on our return from school into consideration when they set out to prepare our evening meals. As I will later explain in some detail, fufu, our main evening meal, was prepared through a laborious manner of pounding the ingredients in a wooden mortar into balls. The balls are then swallowed down with soup. Our parents reckoned with our help in pounding fufu on our return from school. Thus, they timed their preparation of the favorite meal in such a way as to allow the pounding phase to coincide with our return. One could read the anguish in our faces on returning home from a tedious day at school, only to be called upon to pound fufu. Do not blame our parents. They themselves would, until then, also have endured several hours of bone-breaking work under the tropical heat, both on the farm and at home. The pounding of fufu can take anywhere between half an hour and an hour of laborious work, not devoid of considerable sweating during the process. Those who have lived in the tropics will bear me out that there is a rapid transition from daylight to darkness. By 7 p.m., at the latest, our little settlement was engulfed in thick darkness. The school day was not over, though. We still indeed to do our homework. Our school teachers did not reserve homework only for weekend. They also assigned us with tasks that needed to be resolved overnight, ready to be presented in class the next day. We did not have access to electricity. Instead, we had to resort to kerosene, lanterns, or Swiss kerosene lamps and endure the hot blasts of heat that emanated from them. It was no fun learning with those lamps or lanterns. As the case may be, the smell of the burning fuel was, to put it mildly, irritating. While the young academic was already struggling with an assignment, the smell of the burning fuel added salt to the injury. Under such circumstances, any perceived provocation from one or other resident of the home, laughter, a scream, or a shout, could cause aspiring academic to almost explode with fury. Finally, at about 9 p.m., we retired to bed. Good night and sleep well. One will want to wish us. That was indeed well deserved, if only the ambiguous mosquitoes would understand that. But no, instead, they came to pester us. One could somehow understand them, for it was our blood that provided them their dinner. Whatever trouble the mosquitoes caused, initially we were so exhausted from the day's activities that they could not prevent sleep from soon overcoming us. The situation changed in the middle of the night, after we had passed through the deep phase of the sleep. Soon, one began not only to feel the burning sensation resulting from their bite, but be terribly irritated by the whistling noise, emanating not only from Mr. and Mrs. Mosquito, but also their accompanying offsprings. The next chapter, awful experience with the red hot iron. We tried to wash our school uniforms on returning home from the farm on Saturdays. In case we failed to do so, we performed this chore on Sundays. During the dry season, when water was difficult to come by at the home, we carried our dirty items to the new river to get them washed there. During the rainy season, when there was a regular supply of rainwater to fill our water collecting containers, we did the washing at home. One other reason we avoided the New River at that time of year was because it usually flooded its banks. After washing our clothes with our hands, we left them hanging in the sun to dry. At this time, I would like to introduce the reader to the concept of starching. Our school uniform. The cassava or manioc tuber that abounds in our area is rich in starch. We obtain the starch by scratching the tuber free of its skin against the rough metal surface, adding water to the mixture, and finally pouring it on a sieve. The solution so obtained was rich in starch. There were two ways of applying the starch to our uniform. In the first instance, we dipped the uniform into the cold solution and allow it to dry before pressing it with a charcoal iron. The second method involved first boiling the starch and spraying it on the surface of the uniform, pressing it immediately thereafter. He or she who wore a decently starched and pressed school uniform to school felt proud of his or her outfit. The matter did not end there. One could win points for his or her section. The converse was also true. One could be penalized with a negative point for one section if one appeared with a school uniform that was either not properly ironed or not ironed at all. In the latter instance, one could even be caned for putting on such a uniform to school. Our parents were so busy performing the daily chores of life that they had practically no time left to help us with the ironing of our school uniform. In the end, we were left with no option than to do so ourselves. Sometimes the elder siblings help their younger ones perform the task. That was not always the case. However, sometimes the older siblings felt disrespected by their naughty junior ones and left them to sort out their own affairs. We rarely pressed our uniforms on tables. Instead, we did so on bed sheets spread on the bare cemented floor or our room. We had to assume the kneeling position beside the sheets to be able to do so. I still remember an awful experience I had one day as I was pressing my school uniform. I was barely 10 years old at that time. As I knelt beside the bed sheet spread on the floor, moving the red hot iron to and fro on the uniform, the hotly heated iron tilted in one direction. In the process, I lost my balance. Before I could prevent it, the top part of my right thigh, not far from the organ of urination, came into direct contact with the hot metal. Even as I write, the screaming and yelling at the top of my voice thus resulted it still fresh in my memory. The metal bent away a chunk of skin. The shape of a triangle measuring about 5 centimeters at the base and narrowing to about 4 centimeters on each side. Did I receive any painkillers to soothe the pain? Negative. What about antibiotics to prevent infection? Still negative. A tree saying has it that God drives away the ants from the animal deprived of a tail. My parents, in line with that thinking, might have trusted divine grace to help sort the matter out. And so happened, for the wound healed without complications. The next chapter. The call to discipline and the need to improve. The call to discipline and the need to improvise. As in several aspects of life, in the little village, we had to learn to improve. Although the government of the day provided us with free textbooks as well as exercise books. In some areas, as in the case of learning aids, for example, we had to improvise. One area was counters. Although we could probably have purchased them in the big towns, our teachers, desirous of sparing our parents the extra financial burden, asked us to settle our counters we produced either on our own or with the help of our parents. As counters, we cut branches of some of the trees growing in our areas and hewed out 50 or 100 pieces. As the case may be, these we tied together with plastic or cotton thread. Alternatively, we resorted to hairs growing in the area. Each of us collected 50 or 100, dividing them into small sacks, and took them along to the arithmetic class. Each student was expected to display a high standard of discipline or else risk being punished. Punishment was usually in the form of lashes to the palm or to the buttocks. Our female counterparts, however, were usually spared being caned on the buttocks. Instead, they normally received their lashes upon their palms. The boys on our part could either be lashed on our palms or on our buttocks. One could be caned for various reasons, including the following: failure to keep to the personal standards of hygiene expected of each student, keeping the fingernails cut, keeping the teeth clean, keeping the hair short and combed, keeping the school uniform tidy and decently pressed, failure to keep the plot assigned to you, failure to get the homework done in proper time, failure to score well in mental arithmetic or dictation. Chatting in the class in the presence or absence of the class teacher. Yes, we were expected to be silent even when our class teachers were not around. The responsibility fell on the class captain, sometimes elected solely by the class teacher, sometimes selected by the whole class through secret ballots to ensure that order was maintained in the class. Failure on his or her part to do so could lead to him or her being punished. To prevent that kind of situation, he or she usually wrote down the names of those who disturbed the silence during the absence of the teacher, to be submitted when called upon to do so. Punishment was not always corporal. The offending student could, for example, be called upon to write several lines, sometimes up to 500 or even more of the sentences, such as, "I will always be punctual for class," "I will no longer disturb the class," "I won't be rude to my teacher," etc. One could also be assigned a portion of the compound to weed, and so forth. Next chapter, chapter 9. Call it child labor, if you will. During our school days, our teachers used us to perform several kinds of jobs. The jobs varied depending on whether it involved primary or middle school children. We could for example, be used to help a farmer harvested maize? There were two aspects of this. It could be that the farmer had done the harvesting on his own. Our duty was to carry the harvested maize in baskets back home. On certain occasions, we did the harvesting as well as transported the produce to the home of the farmer involved. Rarely could a farmer provide enough baskets for every child. Usually, an announcement was made on the day prior to carrying out the job, calling on every pupil to carry a basket or a tray to school. The very young among us, especially those in primary years 1 to 3, were usually exempted from that type of work. If such a job needed to be done, it was usually carried out during the afternoon session. The morning session, on the other hand, was rarely used for non-academic activity. Later, I will talk in some detail of the making of palm kernel oil in the village. Palm kernel oil is obtained from the kernel, which is embedded in the nuts of the palm kernel oil. Sometimes, school children were used to perform that function. It was not uncommon for the school children to be called upon to fetch water to fill the water containers of their teachers or the wives, and in some cases, the concubines of their teachers. As might be expected, that job was performed mostly in the dry season. We usually collected the water either from wells or the New River, which served Nyanyafuman also. One particular job we did was not devoid of danger, namely the cutting of bamboo sticks. The stick grew widely in the woods around Nyafuman. The bamboo sticks were used in various ways to build fences or hedges around the school, gardens to prevent sheep and goats from destroying the crops, or for constructing raised structures to dry cocoa beans in buildings, etc. Due to the hazards associated with the cutting, we were usually accompanied by parts of the teaching staff who selected those they consider mature enough for the assignment to do the cutting. Other children were left with the duty of carrying the sticks on their heads over a distance of about a mile or more back to school. Because the bamboo stick could attain considerable height, it could hardly be carried by a single student. Instead, two students, one at the head, the other at the tail, were made to carry a single stick back to school. One may want to know what kind of hazard was posed by the bamboo sticks that we cut. The main one involved the cutting itself. We did so with the help of cutlass. Sometimes, after one had cut through about half of the stem, it broke with such force that the stick forcefully sprang into the air. In such a situation, one stood in danger of being pierced in the foot, leg, or even in the body. Though I did not personally witness any of us getting injured on such assignments, reports of cases of school children elsewhere getting hurt, in some cases seriously, by bamboo sticks made their rounds from time to time. What happened to the money earned by the school carrying on such activities? Well, our teachers never tired of reminding us, especially when a job was in the hand, that the money earned was meant for the good of the school, to be used for the purchase of footballs, jerseys for the school team, the acquisition of medication and other material for the first aid box, and also contributed towards the end of year school feast. Still, rumors to the effect that our teachers chopped, a local terminology that stands for embezzled. Our money did not cease to circulate. One wild rumor had it that during one staff meeting, a furious exchange ensued between one member of staff and the head teacher, the junior accusing his superior of embezzling school funds. Tempers were said to have fled to the point that blows were exchanged. The next chapter, the school feast and the day of reckoning. Our day was a school feast to mark the end of a term. The common practice was for each class to organize a feast to mark the end of the first and second terms. The feast for the end of the third term, the academic year, on its part usually involved the whole school. When the feast was organized by a class, the teacher asked students to bring their share of food from home. One had the option to enjoy it alone or share it with his or her friends. The latter was usually the case. Usually, friends joined their tables together and enjoyed their meals together, eating from the same dish. It was an advantage on such occasions to have friends whose parents were well-to-do, who could afford to prepare rich meals that one's own parents could not afford. At the end of the school year, many schools invested part of the money earned during the academic year performing various jobs to throw a party for the whole school population. Depending on how much money the school could afford, a sheep or a goat or several fowl were acquired for the purpose. Usually, rice and yams went with a tasty sauce. Before we were dismissed home for each holiday, our teachers handed out our terminal reports. This was not done confidentially on an individual basis, but rather before the whole class. That was the case at the end of the first and second terms. At the end of the third term, the ritual book placed before an assembly of the whole school. Whatever the setting, the ritual followed a similar pattern. The class teacher stood in front of a class or the school end, beginning from the pupil who attained the overall best in all the subjects downwards. He or she called out the names of the class. At the core of each name, the student concerned stepped forward to collect his or her terminal report. The accompanying applause grew less intense until it ceased altogether by the time it was the turn of the fifth or sixth student. One might imagine the expression on the faces of yellow classmates as name after name followed and they failed to hear their names. The tension was particularly high during the end of the year gathering, when students might realize for the first time that he or she would have to repeat the class. When the news finally came home to such people, some of them broke down in tears. For a while, some were inconsolable. It was a pathetic sight to behold. Next chapter. My cousin, the driver. Our parents could not afford to provide us with toys, so we provided on our own. Among other things, we built our own cars. My cousin, Kwaku driver, had a particular obsession with building cars. It was indeed his obsession with anything that moved on four wheels that earned him the nickname driver. Kwaku designed and constructed his own toy cars, making use of the fiber from the branches of the raffia palm. Whether it was a Bedford truck, a Mercedes-Benz bus, or a Toyota pickup, my cousin was capable of building toy imitations of almost every model of a vehicle known to him. With the help of the raffia palm, after we built the body of the vehicle, we were left with the tires to fit on our vehicles. For this, the roots of the onyina tree provided the answer. Onyina is a tree that grows in our part of the world. These trees can attain considerable sizes and also height. The roots of the young tree were particularly suited for the purpose, being evenly round in circumference. Besides that, it is not particularly hard, which enabled us to cut a wheel out of it using our cutlasses. To obtain the roots, we selected a suitable tree, traced one or more of roots, which can grow several meters from the stem towards the periphery. We then dug around it to lay it bare of soil. Finally, we severed it from main stem and carried it home. Back home, we cut the length of roots into tires, which we fitted to our brand new vehicle. Next chapter. The office of the Gongon Bita at Impintimpi can be likely to that of the press spokesperson at the White House in Washington at 10 Downing Street in London. Selected by the chief from one of the young men of the community. This personage had the duty of announcing to the community any important news or events they needed to know about. This could be something the chief himself wanted to pass on to his subjects, or an event or happening that someone living there wished to pass on to wider community. Such an individual cannot on his or her own request the Gongon Bita to spread the news item on his or her behalf. Instead, tradition requires that he or she calls first on the chief to inform him about the matter. The head of the community, in turn, authorizes the Gongon Bita to spread the news to the community as a whole. How does the Gongon Bita go about his job in Impitimpi? He does so along the main road that, as I mentioned earlier, divides the little settlement into two almost equal halves. Beginning from one end of the road, the moves along the road towards other end, spreading his message. Konkon, konkon, konkon. He beat hard on his gong. Impintimpi. He screams at the top of his voice. I extend warm greetings from Nana. He has asked me to pass such and such messages unto you. Kum kum, kum kum. He beat his gun again to signify the end of the announcement. He then moves on. After a distance of about 100 meters, he stops, beats his gun once again, and repeats the message. From there, he walks another 100 or so meters and repeats the ritual. And so on. Moving along with the street. Moving along the streets of the settlement, beating his gong and broadcasting the message of the chief to the ears of everyone in every corner of the community. It was one of the favorite pastimes of my peers, and I to follow the gong beater as he went about his duty. Children, on some occasion, we did not keep silent as we did so, but instead yelled and cried out at the top of our voices, repeating what he had just announced to the community. At first, we will comfort ourselves in an orderly way. Soon, however, one or more of us will begin again to shout at top of his or her voice. At that stage, he will tend to chase us again. Whoever was first to be caught could expect a knock on the head, even though he or she might be innocent. The gong beater was not paid for his job. However, to compensate him for his role, society exempted him from direct participation in communal labor. The next chapter, joining forces for common good. The community came together on a regular basis to perform assignments beneficial to the community as a whole. Such activities came to be known as communal labor. They were not unique to our little community, but were practiced in several parts of the country. Usually, the community set aside a particular day of the week during which they would meet for that purpose. In the case of Impintimpi, it was Wednesday. How often the society meets for communal labor was not laid down. Instead, it depended on the specific need of the community. There were occasions where weeks, even months, passed without the need for the chief to call the residents together to work for the common good of the society. On other occasions, for example, when a new latrine or a new school block had to be constructed, the community met every Wednesday over the next several weeks to carry out a specific project. Other occasions that called for the coming together of the whole community was the need to weed around the fringes or periphery of the village, clear the path that led to the main river of the weeds that threatened to encroach it, and weeding around the male and female latrines, etc. It was customary for the gong beater to go round the settlement on the evening prior to such a meeting to announce the event. This was done even with everyone was aware of the day, so as to prevent those who failed to show up executing themselves of having forgotten about it. Usually, communal labor was performed separately by the sexes. Occasionally, however, a joint session involving both sexes was held. This was particularly the case when a new building project was undertaken, notably for the school. In that case, the women were sent to fetch the water needed for the project from the river. Every adult who was not prevented by reason of ill health was expected to take part in the day's activities. Only the chief and the gong beater were exempted. Even though not expected to do so, the chief usually was present and appeared to serve as a morale booster for his subjects. Failure to take part in the communal labor without a convincing excuse could lead to the imposition of a fine by the town development committee. This could be in the form of money, pots of palm wine, a bottle of appetition, or combination of any of the three. Chapter 14. Then, as now, the residents of Mpitimpi engaged in subsistence farming. The farmers relied solely on the rains. This set towards the middle of April, lasted till the end of July. This is not to say that it rained continuously during that period. They could, however, reckon with regular rainfall that will facilitate the growth of their crops during that time. The average farmer began to clear the piece of land intended for cultivating in a particular year towards the middle of January, or latest by beginning of February. The first step in the preparation of the land involved clearing it of the thick bush encroaching on it. Father usually mastered that job alone. If the size of the plot to be cleared in a particular year was considerable and his financial resources permitted it, he employed casual labor on a daily basis to assist in the process. The next stage involved the felling of some of the trees on the plot. This was necessary to expose the crops that would be planted to much needed sunshine. The farmers executed the job with their own manpower. The only instruments they relied on was the axe. I could only wonder how Father managed to fell some of the huge trees growing on some of our fields. At times, it took him a whole day of sustained effort to fell a tree of considerable size. In some instances, a tree he had attempted all day to bring down would still be standing at the fall of darkness. In that case, he returned home and continued his effort the next day. Sometimes he received help from the element during interruption. A strong wind that might set in during the night to provide a final blow to send the stubborn tree falling to the ground. The next stage in the preparation of the field involves setting fire to cleared bush. Before doing that, the farmer spent time preparing the periphery of the field with the aim of preventing the fire from spreading beyond its bounds. It was an important precaution, particularly if the field involved was bordered by others occupied with important crops such as cocoa, orange, oil palm trees, etc. One could otherwise end up burning cultivated farmland belonging to oneself or worse still, to another farmer. There were instances when, in spite of all such precautions, the fire indeed jumped into other farmlands to cause destruction. With careful preparation, however, one could greatly reduce the risk. Although very rare, there have been instances where the burning of farmland ended in real tragedy, as the following instances illustrate. Several years ago, a resident of Amantia, the village where mother was born, left home to burn his farmland. He went alone. When he failed to return at the onset of darkness, his anxious relatives went in search of him. On reaching the field was still burning. There was, however, no trace of their relative. Since the field was still burning, they could not enter it to search for him. After searching the areas bordering the field in vain for him, they returned home. They returned early the next morning to continue the search. This time, they could enter the newly prepared field. The fear soon became reality when his badly injured body was found at one end of the farm. Surprised by the flames, he had apparently tried to flee, but to no avail. After the field had been cleared and the bush burnt, the next stage in the cultivation process was the sowing or planting of the crops. The farmers at the Impitimpi, as was the case in several parts of the country, practice mixed crop farming. It is a system of farming whereby several crops are planted on the same piece of land at the same time. We filled our field with two types of crops, cash and food crops. Strictly speaking, only cocoa could be classified as a purely cash crop. All the other crops we planted: cassava, yams, plantains, various kinds of vegetables, served both functions, depending on the yield in a particular year. In the lean season, we kept them for ourselves. On the other hand, if the yield was bountiful, we sold part of the yield and kept the rest for ourselves. It was all hands on board when it came to the planting of the field, including those of the children of the farmer who were big enough for assignment. The various crops were not planted simultaneously, but one after the other. For example, the farmer first planted a particular crop, cocoa, followed by maize, plantain, yam, etc., until the whole piece of cultivated land was filled with the crops he or she wanted to plant. As just mentioned, the farmers' children helped in the planting of the crops on the field. In the case of maize, we placed the seeds in our pockets and went about armed with our cutlasses to plant them. First, we dug a shallow hole with our pointed cutlasses. Next, we placed 3 to 4 seeds into the hole before covering them with soil. We then moved a step or two forward and repeated the procedure. Depending on the size of the field, it could take several days to finish the task of planting one particular crop. Father trusted in the good sense of duty of his children. Children, particularly when towards the end of a tedious day. Still had considerable amounts of gain that needed to be planted in one pocket, and one was tempted to seek a quicker way of getting rid of it. Soon one began to fill each hole with far more than the recommended number of seeds at a time. In the case of maize and cocoa, the day of judgment did not take long to arrive. For the time that elapsed between planting and germinating was only few days in each case. When father or mother, on their regular inspection rounds through the newly cultivated field, came across several maize or cocoa seedlings springing up from the same hole, they will burst out in rage. Who amongst you committed such treachery? As might be expected, each one of us kept quiet. They had no choice but to go round removing the surplus seedlings. The planting process continued until all the crops the farmer set out to plant had been put under the soil. Sometimes it took him or her several weeks of hard work to achieve this. It was in the interest of the farmer to ensure that his field was planted by the middle of April, just about the onset of the rainy season. The respite the farmer enjoyed on the completion of the planting of his or seedling, his or her farm, was usually brief. With the onset of the rains and the springing up of the seedlings, another factor entered the equation. The rain and the fertile soil did not benefit only the plants useful to the farmer, but also the weeds. They did not only compete with the crops for nutrients and sunshine. Some of them threatened to choke the crops also. To avert that situation, the farmer had to weed his or her field as early as possible. In that area also, a farmer counted on the helping hands of his or her children. That phase of the cultivation process coincided with the Easter holidays, whereas our peers in the big towns and cities could enjoy relaxing at home with their parents. We woke up early in the morning, sharpened our cutlasses, and headed for the farm. Sometimes we will eat our breakfast before making for the woods. On other occasions, the boys had to leave early with their father, who usually left home early for the farm without even having his breakfast. He would usually tell us that at that time of day, his stomach was yet to awake from sleep. As long as that had not happened, he did not have the urge to eat anything. The girls were left with their mother to carry on the usual early morning chores in the home, sweeping round the compound, washing the cooking utensils left from the previous evening, fetching water from the stream, etc., before joining us later. After a tedious day's work on the fields, we returned home around 4 p.m. In our little village, we grew what we ate and ate what we grew. Apart from the meat and fish we usually bought from the market, we relied mainly on the produce from our farms to sustain us. Without access to electricity or gas cookers, we had to rely on firewood for our cooking. We carried the wood and the foodstuffs on our heads. To prevent the load pressing too hard on our bare heads, we folded pieces of clothing that we placed on the head to cushion it from direct contact with the burden being carried. As in almost every aspect of daily activity in the village, we, the children, had in this instance also to help carry the items home. Thus, after several hours of hard work on the farm, the farmer's child returned home late in the afternoon with his parents bearing home of the load on his or her head. The situation was not made easy by the scorching African sun or the torrential rains that could set in to pound them mercilessly as they walked home, their necks almost breaking under the heavy load. Sow in tears and reap in joy, so the saying goes. Well, reaping in our case could not be described as a joyful event. With no machines to assist, as the process could be very tedious indeed. Maize was usually the first crop to be harvested. In this case too, the hands of the farmers' children were needed. Usually, their duty was to be behind the adults, a basket on the head or in the hands, to gather the maize being harvested. Next chapter. The tree that produces black gold. A Ghanaian legend has it that once upon a time, a Ghanaian sailor by the name of Tete Kwashi, while returning to Ghana from a trip to Fernando Po, an island off the coast of West Africa, carried some cocoa pods along with him. On his return, he cultivated it on his farmland. Eventually, other residents got hold of cocoa from Tete Kwashi's farmland and cultivated them on their fields. That marked the beginning of the cultivation of cocoa in Ghana. Though the above account is accepted by the majority of Ghanaians, a small number of question the fact that it was indeed Tete Kwashi who had introduced cocoa into the country. Whatever the truth concerning the arrival of cocoa in the country, it is an indisputable fact that cocoa has been and continues to be one of the main foreign indisputable facts that cocoa, the main foreign exchange earners for Ghana. It is not without reason that some have coined the term black gold to refer to the dark brown cocoa bean that even to this day accounts for a considerable proportion of Ghana's foreign exchange earnings. As of June 2010, Ghana was the world's second largest cocoa producer after Ivory Coast, her immediate neighbor to the west. Impintimpi lies within the cocoa growing belt of Ghana, so it is not surprising that cocoa played a very important role in my life. I was, as it were, born into cocoa beans and grew up with cocoa beans. Though, as a child, I did not understand the significance of cocoa beans to the country as a whole. One thing I certainly was aware of was that my parents relied on the income they obtained from the sale of cocoa to provide for everything we needed. By dint of accident, Christmas followed closely on the heels of the main cocoa harvest season. The main cocoa harvest season began in October and lasted till around the end of December. This fact made it possible for my parents, and this can be said of all the cocoa farmers at Impintimpi and elsewhere, to buy new clothing for their children at Christmas. Though at that time, tuition was free from primary school right up to university level. It is no exaggeration to state that without the cocoa beans, my parents would hardly have been in a position to meet the other expenses associated with their children's education. School uniforms, and later the boarding and lodging fees of some of their children who pursued further education. At the time, I was big enough to understand my environment. Father already boasted about 5 different small to medium-sized farmlands spread at different locations at an average distance of about 2 kilometers from the village. These being farmlands on which mature cocoa trees of various ages were growing. In In preceding chapter, I described how the farmer cleared a plot of land for the cultivation of cocoa. Cocoa requires a humid climate, a considerable amount of sunshine, regular rainfall, and fertile soil to grow. It grows best with some overhead shade. The farmer took that fact into consideration when preparing the field meat for the cultivation of cocoa and left some of the tree in the field to provide the required shade for his future cocoa trees. Under suitable conditions, the cocoa plant requires a period of about 5 years from the time of cultivation to the time of bearing of the first fruits. The cocoa beans are found in pods, which are ovoid. Each pod may contain 20 to 60 seeds or beans. The pods may grow to a size of between 15 to 30 centimeter or 6 to 12 inch in length and 8 to 10 centimeters or 3 to 4 inches in width, with a weight of 500 grams. When matured, initially the pods are light green in color. When ripe, they assume a yellow to orange color. A cocoa farm filled with trees, each carrying several types of yellow pods. When plucking of the pods was over, the next stage involved gathering all the small heaps of pods to a main collection point on the farm. Usually, the farmer selected one selecting point on each farm for this purpose. The helpers carried the pods in baskets woven from either the oil palm tree or the raffia palm, or both. The baskets, which were of various sizes, were assigned to the helpers depending on their age and physical ability, depending on the size of the farm, the number of helpers involved, and also the yield in the particular year. It could take a few to several days to gather all the pods to the collection point. Next came the task of slashing the pods to collect the seeds. If it involved only a small yield, the farmer did the job alone with the help of his or her family. On the other hand, if the yield was considerable, the farmer invited other members of the community to assist in the process. The pods were slashed open with the help of a cutlass to reveal the cocoa beans surrounded by the fruity pulp of the pod. The whole contents of the pod was then emptied into a basket. Sitting beside each basket was an assistant, usually a woman or a child, big enough for the task of freeing the beans from the pulp surrounding them. The beans were then gathered into a single heap on the broad leaves of the banana or plantain trees already spread at the location not far from the workers. Each heap of beans was tightly covered with the help of additional banana or plantain leaves and left over a period of 5 to 7 days to ferment. After that period, the beans were carried home for drying. When the yield was considerable, the farmer was not able to perform the assignment with his or her family alone. Instead, he or she went round the village, solicit the help of residents above age of about 15 years to assist in doing so. The help offered the farmer by his or her neighbors cannot be undervalued, as it was not a one-way street. For he or she could also be invited by them to help them transport their cocoa beans home for drying. Once at home, the beans were spread on mats, especially woven from the branches of the raffia palm for the purpose of drying the cocoa beans. The mats were not spread on the bare ground, but on wooden structures constructed in open spaces at several locations within the settlement. These structures stood about meters above ground level throughout the day and at intervals of about an hour. With the help of his bare hands, or especially constructed wooden implements, stirred the beans to facilitate the drying process. It was the wish of the farmer to be spared rain throughout the period it took for the beans to dry. As might be imagined, this was not always the case, for the tropical rain could set in, sometimes at short notice, to disrupt the drying process of the beans. At the first sign of the rain, the farmer rushed to cover his precious beans. Sometimes the rains set in at a time when the particular farmer was not at home but working on the fields. In such instances, he or she could count on the assistance of whoever happened to be around at that time. After about 14 days of daily exposure to the sun, the beans were usually dry enough to be sold. The experienced farmer did not need someone to point this out to him. To be on the safe side, however, he or she chose to either take a few samples to the CMB or invite them to come and verify things for themselves. After the staff of the CMB had satisfied themselves that the beans were dry enough to be sold, they handed the farmer jute sacks, specially produced for the storage and transport of the cocoa beans. The farmer filled them with his precious beans and carried them on his head or shoulders to the purchasing spot. The beans were sold in loads. Usually, the government announced the price for a load of cocoa for a particular year weeks before the beginning of the main cocoa season of that particular year. Father usually preferred that one of his young academics accompanied him to the CMB. One could tell from the facial expressions of the clerk and his assistants that they were not amused with such intruders. Father was acting in line with the saying, "Trust but verify," for rumors circulated that many a purchasing clerk and his or her staff could advantage of the prevailing illiteracy among the overwhelming majority of farmers for their own personal gain. They were alleged to declare a sack filled with beans weighing well over 60 IBS, still as a load. Long after unsuspecting farmer had left the premises, they would reweigh it and pocket the extra weight for themselves, or so it was alleged. These were These were unsubstantial allegations, of course, though the fact that the clerk of the CMB were counted among the well-to-do in society lent some credence to the rumors. The tree with 1,001 uses. That's the next chapter. In the foregoing chapter, I dwelt on the cultivation of cocoa and the financial benefits the farming population derived from it. I would like to dedicate this chapter to a plant that also provided immensely benefit to the peasants of Impitimpi and elsewhere in the country, namely the oil palm tree. The oil palm tree enjoyed one vital advantage over the cocoa tree. Indeed, whilst devoting much of our time and energy in cultivating of cocoa, hardly anyone amongst us knew what the cocoa beans were good for. This could be said of the average cocoa farmer in the country. It was only later on in life that I got to know that cocoa was used to produce chocolate, cocoa butter, cocoa beverages, etc. Even if anyone in the village was aware of this, what good could that be for us? Imagine a resident of Impintimpi spending money on items like chocolate, cocoa spread, and beverages made of cocoa. Who would have thought of doing that when there was hardly any money for more pressing needs of daily lives? That may sound absurd in the reader, but indeed, we labored all year long to produce cocoa without affording to purchase some of the products derived from it. The situation was different when it came to the oil palm tree. Apart from the money the farmer obtained from selling some of the several products he or she obtained from it, he or she could also make direct use of some of the products, starting from the branches downwards to the roots. I shall provide a brief outline of some of benefits the plant brought to residents of the little village. That may the fiber from the leaves was used for brooms to tidy our homes and rooms. The leaves were also woven into roofing sheets to cover our buildings. The fiber from the palm branches could be woven into baskets. These, among other things, were employed to cut foodstuffs, cocoa beans, firewood, palm fruits, etc., home from our farms. The soft oil pulp of the palm fruit could be used to prepare delicious palm soup. Still, staying with the pulp, one could extract palm oil from it, which is rich in vitamins. The palm fruit contains palm nuts. The palm nuts, when cracked open, reveals the embedded kernel, commonly known as palm kernel. Palm kernel oil obtained from the kernel is also edible. The inventive human mind went beyond being satisfied with the benefits outlined above. It seems indeed it has gone on to probe the plants for further possible uses. In due course, it was discovered that the tree with the 1,001 uses could also be tapped to obtain palm wine, which in turn could be distilled to obtain a highly potent alcoholic drink known locally as akpeteshi. More about palm wine and akpeteshi in a later chapter. Despite the benefits outlined above, when I was young, hardly any farmer at Impintimpi considered the cultivation of the oil palm tree. Instead, they relied on those that grew wild. They were indeed not in short supply, for they spread from place to place by several kinds of animals that fed on the fruits: squirrels, rats, mice, and various kinds of birds. It was several years later when, partly as a result of unstable weather conditions and decreasing yields and the falling prices of cocoa, and the income from cocoa began to decrease, that some residents began to feel that oil palm is important. The oil palm tree, unfortunately, is interlinked with a tragic family history, as mother used to tearfully narrate. One day, my maternal grandmother left home to pick a ripe palm fruit. The palm tree involved was quite tall, so he had to climb a ladder to reach the top. As he did, so he suddenly lost his balance, just as he had almost reached the top of the ladder and fell to the ground. As he fell, he was pierced in his side by the branch of a tree. According to mother, he managed to walk back home. The broken branch saw protruding from his body, but died shortly after reaching home. The next chapter. One fruit, two edible oils. As I mentioned earlier, two types of edible oil can be obtained from the fruit of the oil palm. Palm oil, which is reddish looking, is extracted from the pulp that forms the outermost part of the fruit. Lying inside the pulp is the nut, which can be cracked to reveal a soft kernel embedded in it. Palm kernel oil, which is dark yellow in color, can be extracted from the kernel. The first step in preparing palm oil was to boil considerable amounts of palm fruit in a large dish for about half an hour. Next, the cooked fruits were placed in a large wooden mortar and pounded for several minutes using wooden pestles. The duty usually fell on the children of the home to carry out this task. After pounding for a while, the ensuing paste was emptied into a large bowl. Lukewarm water was added to it. Using our bare hands, we stirred the paste until it dissolved in the water. The next stage involved removing the palm nut, the outer cover of which it is hard enough to withstand the pounding process without getting cracked. The mixture was then poured on a sieve to separate the orange colored mixture from the fiber of the pulp. Next, the mixture was poured into a large dish and allowed to boil on an open fire for several minutes. Finally, the fire was quenched and the soup allowed to stand for a while to cool down. As it did so, the red-looking palm oil began to flow on the surface of the soup. This was collected using a large kitchen spoon. The remaining soup was then poured away. If preparing palm oil was a tedious undertaking, extracting palm kernel oil from the palm kernel was even more tiresome. The first step in the process involved cracking the nut to free the kernel embedded in it. This was achieved by placing a few nuts in the hollow of a stone, especially cut for the purpose, and hitting them hard with a round shape, quite heavy stone a few times until the nut cracked to expose the kernels. The kernels were then gathered into a special container and roasted for several minutes over an open fire. According to Mother, in earlier times, they had to manually pound the roasted kernel into a paste. Thanks to a food milling station that had the meantime been set up at Nyafuman, we didn't have to do so any longer. The paste so obtained was placed in a large pan, mixed with some water, and heated over an open fire for several minutes. After a while, palm kernel oil began to float on the surface of the mixture and was collected. Next chapter, chapter 18. Simple peasant cracking complicated chemical formulas. Some women in the little village were engaged in some soap making. Soap, the chemist will tell us, is basically the alkaline salt of a fatty acid. In other words, it is the product that results from the reaction of fatty acid and a strong base, that's alkaline. How these simple peasant women none of whom had ever sat at a school desk. Yes, none of whom had ever even heard terms like chemistry, fatty acid, alkali, and what have you, conceived the idea that they could produce their own homemade soap continues to baffle me with this day. Yet their method, though crude, was based on the same principle one will read of in any chemistry book. Yes, the same principle upon which some of the chemical giants of our day produce their trademark soaps. As a first step in soap production, the women collected the pods that were left over after the cocoa pods had been slashed and emptied of their contents, as well as other materials such as skins from the plantain fruits, barks of trees, etc. These were left in the sun for several days to dry. They were then set on fire and burnt. The resulting ash was gathered into a large basin and mixed with water. The mixture thus produced was poured into a fine sieve and filtered. The liquid thus produced was boiled over an open fire for several minutes until it was reduced to a paste. As a final time, palm oil or palm kernel was poured over the paste. The resulting picture looks clear. The mixture is being stirred at the same time without any instrument to assist her. The soap maker at Impintimpim determined by means of the experience of her eyes when the soap making process was complete. Finally, the mixture was allowed to stand for several days to cure or to set. The result, Cocodoma, also known by others as Africa black soap, can be used to wash clothes as well as the body. It is also said to possess medicinal as well as cosmetic attributes, capable of relieving rashes and scalp irritations. Also good for softening of rough and chapped skin, as well as facilitating the healing process of it. Chapter 19. The Iron Lady in Pintimpi. As I mentioned earlier, palm wine is obtained by tapping the oil palm tree. In Pintimpi and several places in Ghana, the tapper first has to fell the entire tree before tapping can take place. In other communities, the sap is collected from the cat's flower of the still standing palm tree. During the first few days of tapping the white liquid that collects its sweet and free of alcohol, the sweet alcohol free sap is derided by many a lover of palm wine, regarding it as a drink for women and children. Indeed, when we were children, that was what we yearned for. We either accompanied father on his daily tapping rounds to drink the sap at source, or else begged him to carry it home to us. With the help of atmospheric and also residual yeast left in the collecting container, palm sap begins to ferment shortly after collection. Within hours, fermentation yields an aromatic wine of up to 4% alcohol content. The wine may be allowed to ferment longer, up to a day, to yield a stronger, more sour and acidic taste, something preferred by the seasoned palm wine drinker. Throughout the time I was growing up, father supplemented his income by tapping palm wine. Like most other tappers in the village, he did not tap only for oil palm tree, but also raffia palm, which is a variant of the palm family. At Impintimpi and also in several parts of rural area of Ghana. Palm wine is usually sold from makeshift hut built with bamboo sticks and palm branches and covered with sheets woven with the leaves of the raffia palm. The palm wine tappers hut, as they are known, is in effect a kind of pub or drinking bar. At the time I was growing up in the village, there were at many times 2 or 3 individuals who were engaged in palm wine tapping. It was not their main occupation. They only did so to supplement the earnings they derived from their farms. The palm wine tappers usually arrived with their produce late in the afternoon. At a time when the majority of residents had returned from the day's activity on their farms. Palm wine is usually drank from calabashes. It's indeed an heart of the seasoned palm wine drinker to enjoy drink in a plastic cup. For example, whoever was below the age of about 20 was not permitted to drink in the palm wine tapper's hut. This was not a law passed by the state, but rather a norm set and enforced by society. Whoever attempted to go against it could face the retribution of the adults gathered there. Though not permitted to drink there themselves, children big enough to do so could help their parents sell their produce at the palm wine tapper's hut. I had a first-hand taste of life in the palm wine tapper's hut when I was about 10 years old. Owing to an ailment to my left ankle, I was unable to walk to school. a situation that persisted for 2 years. In the course of time, Papa Kwadwo Edu, a good friend of father's, sought and obtained permission from him for me to assist him sell his palm wine. For the teenager dying from boredom resulting from the forced interruption of schooling, the opportunity brought a very welcome change. It was an unwritten law of society that only men were expected to drink inside the palm wine tapper's hut. Ya Anima, a tall and well-built lady who may be described as the Iron Lady of the village, seemed unimpressed by this form of discrimination of society towards women, and appeared there on a regular basis to, as she puts it, quench her thirst. Hardly anyone she met there dared voice their opposition. The reason was not difficult to fathom. The Iron Lady did not shun confrontation with anyone, not even those of the opposite sex. On a few occasions, she engaged some of the men in a fight and prevailed over them. Okay, it's time for break. We shall go for our first break and resume after the break.
baabi bi akɔ